we're doing something a little bit differently. Get ready, get cozy, because it's story time with Kiyaya and Daniel. From the Eddie Dickens trilogy, A House Called Awful End. A message to my American readers, at no extra cost. Greetings from across the Atlantic. I'm so delighted that A House Called Awful End has been published in the United States that I want to say a few special words to my American readers. Yes, you. The story you're about to read was originally written in installments for my nephew, Ben, who was at boarding school in England while his parents were living in Russia. Instead of sending him letters about how many cups of tea I drunk or how hard it had rained, there's plenty of tea for drinking and rain in England, I decided to send him a silly adventure story in installments with a new episode every 2 weeks. The book you now have in your hand or clenched between your teeth, if you're nearsighted or hungry, is the result. Of course, when I was writing those letters, I had no idea they'd end up becoming this book. But they did. May your lives be full of such good fortune too. Philip Ardagh, 2002.
Hi, my name is Daniel Carter, certified personal trainer through National Academy of Sports Medicine and certified nutrition coach through Precision Nutrition. So, we have your training program here, right? Now, what do we eat? The million-dollar question. We have protein, carbs, and fats. This is where I help you break it down. All the steps, all the coaching, right here on your phone. Add it to the top of your plan, and now you're good to go, step by step. Contact me, more information.
Stories are such an important part of our lives. Join my friend Kiyaya and I for Get Cozy, because it's story time with Kiyaya and Daniel, where we share some of the greatest picture books and chapters from children's and young adult literature to inspire you to keep embedding literacy into your days. I'm Daniel, and Kiyaya and I are here to share this all with you. Episode 1, Crinkly Around the Edges, in which Eddie Dickens is sent away for his own good. When Eddie Dickens was 11 years old, both his parents caught some awful disease that made them turn yellow, go a bit crinkly around the edges, and smell of old, hot water bottles. There were lots of diseases like in those days. Perhaps it had something to do with all that thick fog, those knobbly cobbled streets, and the fact that everyone went everywhere by horse, even to the bathroom. Who knows? It's very contagious, said his father. And catching, said his mother, sucking on an ice cube shaped like a famous general. They were in Eddie's parents' bedroom, which was very dark and dingy and had no furniture in it except for a large double bed and an even larger wardrobe and 32 different types of chair designed to make you sit up straight even if your wrists were handcuffed to your ankles. Why are you sucking on an ice cube shaped like a famous general? Eddie asked his parents, who were propped up against piles of pillows in their impressively ugly double bed. Dr. Muffin says that it helps with the swelling, said his mother. In fact, because she had a famous general-shaped ice cube in her mouth, what she actually said was, Dr. Muffin says that it helps with the swelling. But Eddie managed to translate. What swelling? He asked politely. His mother shrugged, then suddenly looked even more yellow and even more crinkly around the edges. And why do they have to be famous general-shaped? Asked Eddie. He always asked a lot of questions, and whenever he asked lots of questions, his father would say, questions, questions. Questions, questions, said his father. Told you. But why a famous general? Eddie repeated. Surely the shape of the ice cube can't make any difference. Shows how much you know, muttered his mother, which meant and still means, shows how much you know. His father rustled the bedclothes. "One does not question the good doctor," he said, "especially when one is a child." He was a small man, except for when he was sitting up in bed. In this position, he looked extremely tall. Then Eddie's mother rustled the bedclothes. It was easy to make them rustle because they were made entirely from brown paper bags glued together with those extra strips of gum paper you sometimes get if you buy more than one stamp at the post office. Postage stamps were a pretty new idea back then, and everyone, except for great-great-great-aunt on my mother's side of the family, was excited about them. One good thing about there being so few stamps in those days was that no one had yet come up with the idea of collecting them and sticking them in albums, and being really boring about them. Stamp collectors didn't exist. Another good thing about being no stamp collectors was that English teachers couldn't sneak up behind on some defenseless child and ask how to spell philatelist. Anyhow, even for those days, having brown paper bedclothes wasn't exactly usual. Quite the opposite, in fact. Bedclothes used to be an even grander affair then than they are now. There were no polyester-filled duvets with separate washable covers. Oh no. Back then, there were underblankets and undersheets and top sheets and middle sheets and 7 different kinds of overblankets. These ranged from ones thicker than a plank of wood, but not so soft, to ones that had holes in them that were supposed to be there. To make a bed properly, the average chambermaid went through 6 to 8 weeks training at a special camp. Even then, not all of them finished the course. And those that didn't finish spent the rest of their working lives living in cupboards under the stairs. The cupboard under the stairs of the Dickens household was occupied by Gibbering Jane. She spent her days in the darkness alongside a variety of mops, buckets, and brooms, mumbling about hospital corners and ruckled chenille. She never came out and was fed slices of ham and any other food that was thin enough to slip under the bottom of the door. Yeah, it is kind of strange. The reason why Mr. and Mrs. Dickens had rustling brown paper sheets and blankets was that this was part of the treatment Dr. Muffin always giving them. That Dr. Muffin was always giving very strict instructions about the treatments. The smell of old hot water bottles had almost reached unbearable on Eddie's what I'm prepared to breathe in scale, and he held his hanky up to his face. "You'll have to leave the room, my boy," said his father. "You'll have to leave the house," said his mother. "We can't risk you going all yellow and crinkly and smelling horrible. It would be a terrible waste on all that money we spent on turning you into a little gentleman. Which is why we're sending you to stay with Mad Uncle Jack," explained his father. "I didn't know I had a Mad Uncle Jack," gasped Eddie. He'd never heard of him. He sounded rather an exciting relative to have. "I didn't say your Mad Uncle Jack. He's my Mad Uncle Jack," said his father. "I do wish you'd listen. That makes him your great-uncle." "Oh," said Eddie disappointedly. "You mean Mad Great-Uncle Jack." Then he realized he hadn't heard of him either, and he sounded just as exciting as the other one. "When will I meet him?" "He's in the wardrobe," said his mother, pointing at the huge wardrobe at the foot of the bed, in case her son had forgotten what a wardrobe looked like. Eddie Dickens pulled open the door to the wardrobe gingerly. It was a ginger wardrobe. Inside, among his mother's dresses, stood a very, very, very tall and very, very, very thin man, with a nose that made a parrot's beak look not so beaky. "Hello," he said with a U and not with an E. It was very definitely a hello and not a hello. Mad Uncle Jack had put out his hand. Eddie shook it. His little gentleman lessons hadn't been completely wasted. Mad Uncle Jack stepped out of the wardrobe and onto an oval mat knitted by children from the St. Horrid's Home for Grateful Orphans. Remember that place? St. Horrid's Home for Grateful Orphans. There, I've written it out for you a second time. Never let it be said that I don't do anything for you. Remember the name. You'll come across it again one day, and probably between the covers of this book. "So, you are Edmund Dickens," said Mad Uncle Jack, studying the boy. "Yes, sir," said Eddie, because his first name really was Edmund. Eddie Dickens's father cleared his throat. He used a miniature version of the sort of brush the local sweep used to clear block chimneys. This was all part of Dr. Muffin's treatment. Edmund, said Mr. Dickens, you are to go with my uncle and live with him until your dear sweet mother and I... He paused and kissed Mrs. Dickens on the part of her face that was the least yellow, and the least crinkly at the edges, a small section just behind her left ear. Yes, I'm sorry, not the ears. I know. Are well again, excuse me. You must never wear anything green in his presence. You must always drink at least 5 glasses of lukewarm water a day, and you must always do as he says. Is that clear? Yes, father, said Eddie. And Jonathan, added his mother, for Jonathan was the pet name she called Eddie when she couldn't remember his real one. Yes, mother? Do be careful to make sure that you're not mistaken for a runaway orphan and taken to the orphanage, where you will then suffer cruelty, hardship, and misery. Don't worry, mother, that'll never happen, said Eddie Dickens, dismissing the idea as ridiculous. If only he had listened. Mad Uncle Jack wanted to use the bathroom before he went, and being unfamiliar with the house, he found it difficult to get his horse up the stairs without knocking down 1 or 2 of the family portraits off the wall. The fact that he'd only nailed the portraits up there himself minutes before made it all the more annoying. He took the paintings with him whenever he strayed more than 11 miles from his house, because his house was actually 12 miles from the nearest place. That meant he always kept them with him. A part of the treatment was that neither Mr. Dickens nor his wife, Mrs. Dickens, should leave their bed more than 3 times a day, because they had both already been up twice that day, and both planned to get up later for an arm wrestling competition against their friends and neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Thackeray, who lived over at the Grange. Neither of Eddie's parents could get up to see him off. Instead, the bed was lowered from their window on a winch, constructed from the sheets that were no longer in use since the treatment had begun. Good luck, my boy, said Eddie's father. Under such extreme circumstances I would kiss you, but I don't want you catching this. Get well, father, said Eddie. Be good, Simon, said his mother. Simon was the nickname Mrs. Dickens would use when she couldn't remember that his real name was Edmund and that his pet name was Jonathan. Be good. I will, said Eddie. Get well, mother. It had started to rain, and the raindrops mixed with the tears that poured down his mother's face. She was busy peeling an onion. Episode 2, Even Madder Maud, in which Eddie first meets Malcolm. Or is it Sally? When Eddie Dickens climbed into Mad Uncle Jack's covered carriage, he found that it was already occupied. In the corner, an elderly woman was stroking a stoat. You must be Malcolm, said the old woman with a voice that could grate cheese. No, madam, my name is Edmund, said Eddie. I was talking to the stoat, snarled the woman, pulling the creature closer to her. Well, she demanded, staring at the animal. The stoat said nothing. It didn't even twitch or blink. The woman seized it by the tail and held it aloft, which in those days is language for up a bit. It was as stiff as a board. Are you Malcolm? She demanded. It was around about then that Eddie Dickens realized that the woman must be completely crazy, and that the animal must be completely stuffed. He took a seat opposite the woman. Put that seat back, she screamed, so Eddie did as he was told and sat down. Just then, Mad Uncle Jack stuck his thinnest of thin heads through the door of the carriage. Ignore her. She's quite mad, he said gruffly. Who is she, sir? Asked Eddie. Sally Stoat, said his great-uncle. Did she get that name from that stuffed animal she's hugging? Asked Eddie. It was the stoat I was referring to, you impudent whelp, cried his great-uncle. That good lady is my wife, Mad Aunt Maud. Your great aunt, and there's most certainly nothing mad about her. Eddie's face went beetroot red. I do beg your pardon, great-uncle, Eddie spluttered. And you, great-aunt, he said with terrible embarrassment. He hadn't even left the driveway of his own home, and he had already managed to offend them both. Enough said mad Uncle Jack. I despise closed carriages, so shall be lashing myself to the roof along with our luggage. I shall see you when we reach Awful End. Awful End? Our home. Your home. Until your dear mother and father are cured of their terrible affliction, mad Uncle Jack explained. Eddie's great-uncle clambered onto the roof where Eddie could hear him strapping himself into place next to his trunk. Drive on! Mad Uncle Jack shouted. Nothing happened. Driver, he instructed, drive on! It was then that he must have remembered that they didn't have a driver. Eddie could hear him unstrapping himself and clambering across the roof above his head to take up position on the driver's chair. Mad Uncle Jack gave a strange clicking noise that you sometimes hear people make to horses before moments they flick their reins and the carriage pulls off. Eddie thought he even heard the flicking of the reins, but this was followed by silence, except for the gentle patter of raindrops that were falling onto the stuffed stoat that his great-aunt was sticking out of the open window. Did you have a good war, dear? She asked Eddie. What war was that, great-aunt? Eddie asked politely. How many have you been in? She asked. None, as a matter of fact, said Eddie. She was as tricky to talk to as her husband. Then don't be so particular, she replied, pulling the stoat back into the dry of the carriage. Was Malcolm thirsty? Was he? Did he like his little drinky? No horse, called out a voice that Eddie recognized as belonging to his father, even though it sounded more yellow and crinkly at the edges than usual. Eddie stood up and looked out of the window across the driveway to his parents, who were sitting by the front door in their bed. The weather wasn't doing their bedclothes much good. The brown paper bags looked a darker brown and were positively soggy. If his parents stayed out much longer, their bedding would soon turn to pulp. Eddie suspected that papier-mâché wasn't a part of Dr. Muffin's treatment. No horse, his father repeated, pointing to the front of the carriage. Eddie climbed out, stepped onto the driveway, and looked back at the carriage. He could see the problem. In the carriage sat Mad Aunt Maud with her stuffed stoat by the name of either Malcolm or Sally, depending on who he was to believe. On the roof of the carriage were Eddie's trunk and his great-uncle's family portraits that went with him always. And at the front of the carriage was his very thin and very mad Uncle Jack, reins in one hand and a whip in the other. But the problem was, and Mr. Dickens had put it very well, that there was no horse. Your great-uncle left him in the bathroom, Mrs. Dickens shouted, wiping away a tear from the corner of her eye. If the truth be told, what she actually shouted was, Your great-uncle left him in the bathroom, because she had a whole peeled onion in her mouth. A moment later, Mr. Dickens's gentleman's gentleman led the horse out of the house and hitched him to Mad Uncle Jack's carriage. Thank you, Daphne, said Mad Uncle Jack. Very good, sir, replied the gentleman's gentleman. A gentleman's gentleman, he knew that it was not his place to point out that he wasn't actually called Daphne, but Dawkins. No, his place was a large basket in the kitchen with plenty of tissue paper, and he couldn't complain. Mr. Thackeray's gentleman's gentleman was over at the Grange, was far worse off. His place was on a small log behind a coal scuttle in the tackle room. Dawkins hadn't the slightest idea what a tackle room was, but had never thought to ask. With the horse now in position, The carriage pulled away, and they were off. Eddie waved out the window at his parents until they became small dots in the distance. Perhaps this was part of their illness, or perhaps it had to do with perspective and it being a very long driveway. "I think you should remove your clothes now," said Mad Aunt Maud as the carriage bumped along the wheel ruts of an unmade up road. If Eddie Dickens had been beetroot red with embarrassment before, he had gone blushing beetroot red. "I beg your pardon?" he said, hoping that he hadn't heard her right. I think you should remove your clothes now," she confirmed. Why might that be, Aunt Maud?" he inquired as politely as possible, wishing that he was anywhere else in the whole wide world than in a carriage with this woman. "If you wear all those clothes in here, you will have nothing to put on when we step out of the carriage, and you will be cold," said Mad Aunt Maud. "I should have thought that was perfectly obvious." "But I'll be cold in here in the meantime, Great Aunt," Eddie was quick to point out. Great Aunt Maud glared at him. If looks could kill, he would have been seriously injured by this one. "Have you ever thought of growing a mustache?" she asked suddenly. "I'm only 11, he protested. "Quiet!" snapped Mad Aunt Maud. "I was asking Malcolm here." She gave the stuffed stoat a friendly rub between his glass eyes. "Oh, not there either? Sorry, Kiyaya." The stuffed stoat said nothing, unlike you. Eddie wondered if he'd be able to survive a whole journey sharing a carriage with this lunatic. At least she'd seemed to have forgotten about telling him to take his clothes off. "Now come on, young man," said Mad Aunt Maud. "Remove them at once." Eddie groaned. To break the journey, Mad Uncle Jack stopped at a coaching inn called the Coaching Inn. It was an unimaginative part of the countryside, and to call it anything other than the Coaching Inn might have confused both the locals and the passing trade. Both the locals were there to greet Mad Uncle Jack's party. They were the landlord and landlady, and Mr. and Mrs. Loaf. Neither of them batted an eyelid when Eddie stepped from the carriage, wearing nothing but his undershirt and a pair of long johns. In those days, wearing nothing but your undershirt and long johns was considered being undressed. You couldn't really get much more naked than that. If there had been movie theaters in those days, which there weren't, and they had shown a film of someone on the beach wearing nothing but his undershirt and long johns, there would have been an outrage. Men with large beards would have set up barricades, and there would have been riots in the street. Most people went through life without realizing that they could actually remove their undershirts and long johns. They simply assumed that they were part of them, like fingernails and hair. They simply assumed that these undergarments were their skin, made out of a different material from their face, hands, and feet, and with buttons on them. If anyone had appeared in just a pair of boxer shorts or swimming trunks, the womenfolk would have had an attack of the vapors, and the menfolk would have exploded in a rage at the indecency of it. What exactly is an attack of the vapors is unclear, because there is no such thing as womenfolk anymore, and there is certainly no such thing as the attack of the vapors. If a person did suffer from such an attack in Eddie Dickens's day, however, it seemed to involve a high-pitched squeal, a swooning, and a falling to the ground, or floor, with much crumpling of the dress. The way to assist a gentlewoman after such an attack was to wave a small bottle labeled smelling salts beneath her nose. As with an attack of the vapors, smelling salts don't exist today, nor do bath salts. Everyone uses bubble bath or shower gel, which is all very interesting. As a result, when Eddie stepped out of the carriage outside the Coaching Inn, he felt as naked as you would if you were completely in the nutty, except perhaps for your watch, despite the fact that he was wearing more clothes than the rest of us would wear at a day on the seaside. He therefore expected both of the locals, the landlord and landlady, Mr. and Mrs. Loaf, to be horrified, but not at all. "This is Master Eddie," said Mad Uncle Jack, climbing down and standing beside his great-nephew. "Please arrange to have him stabled and arrange for 2 rooms, one for me and my good lady wife, and one for my horse." "Very good, Mad Mr. Dickens," said Mrs. Loaf. She obviously knew Mad Uncle Jack well, but it would be rude to call him Mad Uncle Jack because she wasn't one of the family. "This way, please, though I do wish you weren't staying." While his great-aunt and great-uncle and their horse were shown to their rooms by his wife, Mr. Loaf led Eddie to the stables. "You'll sleep here," he said. "There's plenty of straw, so you should be warm and comfortable." "But why should I have to sleep out here while the horse gets to sleep in the inn?" asked Eddie, trying not to sound too pathetic and not too helpless. "Perhaps your great-uncle can only afford 2 rooms, the landlord suggested. "And then there's the fact that he's completely mad." "Good point," nodded Eddie, shivering a little. "You know, Master Edmund, that great-uncle of yours never pays his bill," Mr. Loaf continued. "Then why do you let him keep staying here?" asked Eddie. "Well, he sort of pays, see, but not with money," said the man. He was carrying Eddie's trunk, which he now placed on a few bales of hay. "He pays without money?" asked Eddie Dickens, frantically opening the trunk lid and pulling on the first garment he could find. It was one of Dr. Muffin's chin-to-toe body stockings, which was knitted from coarse black wool and covered him up to his neck. He felt a lot less naked now. "Then what does he pay with?" "Well, usually with dried fish," the landlord of the coaching inn explained. 2 dried hake for a double room per night, and half a halibut for a single room. I never asked him to pay in fish. And I never said he could pay in fish, but pay in fish he always does." "So what do you do with all this dried fish?" asked Eddie, sitting on his trunk. "I send it to your father, and knowing what rates I charge and the method of fishology by which his uncle pays, he then converts the fish into money and sends me the exact amount." "You know my father?" asked Eddie excitedly. He had only been gone from his parents for half a day, and he was missing them already. This was only the 3rd time in his entire life that he had been away from home, and it felt strange. The first time he had been away from home was when he had been sent to sea. This was from when he was a year old to when he was old enough to go to school. The second time he had been from when he was old enough to go to school until his 10th birthday. No wonder it felt so odd in that strange stable. "No, I have never had the honor nor the privilege of meeting your father in person, Master Edmund," said Mr. Loaf, "but we do communicate by post." "Aha," said Eddie. "That would explain the strange parcels my father so often takes to his study. I thought they smelled of dried fish." His eyes lit up. "Your eyes just lit up," said the landlord in complete and utter amazement. "No," said Eddie, "that was just a figure of speech." "I thought it had more to do with the body's electricity," said Mr. Loaf. There was a lot of excitement about electricity in those days before electric light, electric fridges, and electric eels. That last one was a lie. There were most definitely electric eels way back then. How can we be so sure? Because Mad Uncle Jack would always tip Mrs. Loaf with a dried electric eel at the end of each stay at the coaching inn. He was nothing if not generous, as Mr. Loaf so rightly said, and completely mad. Episodes 1 and 2 from A House Called Awful End. This book always makes me chuckle. Just the figurative language and the way that the characters come alive in Philip Ardagh's language are amazing. But are you hooked? Are you interested in reading more? Let us know what you think on our social media, at Stitching Wolf on Facebook and Instagram, or pop me and my friend Kiyaya here an email at getkozy at STITCHINGwolfDesigns.com. We'll be back in another day for another story when it's time for us to get cozy, because it'll be story time with Kiyaya and Daniel. Stay happy and healthy. We're thinking of all of you.